The morning sunlight filtered through the cream-colored curtains of Sarah's suburban home, casting soft streaks of light across the polished hardwood floors. It was a beautiful day, yet Sarah felt none of its warmth. She leaned against the kitchen counter, stirring her coffee absently, the rhythmic clinking of the spoon against the ceramic mug, the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. Her husband, James, had left hours ago on another one of his business trips. As always, their goodbye had been brief. A quick peck on her cheek, a distracted "love you," before he disappeared out the door, laptop in hand. Sarah let out a sigh and turned her gaze toward the window, watching as the neighborhood came alive. Cars backed out of driveways, kids hurried to catch the school bus, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. It was all so routine, so predictable. Just like her life. She glanced at her reflection in the window, the hint of dark circles under her eyes betraying another restless night. James's absence didn't bother her as much as the emptiness that seemed to stretch between them even when he was home. Their conversations had become transactional, their affection mechanical. It wasn't that she didn't love him. She did. Or at least she thought she did. But love, she realized, was not the same as desire, and it was desire she hadn't felt in years. Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of dripping water. Sarah frowned and set her coffee down, following the noise to the guest bathroom. She opened the door and immediately spotted the culprit, a steady drip of water pooling beneath the sink. With a groan, she knelt to inspect it, only to realize that the problem was beyond her meager knowledge of plumbing. This house was supposed to be a dream, spacious, modern, everything she and James had ever wanted, but lately it felt more like a gilded cage. Each dripping faucet or creaking floorboard another reminder of the cracks forming in their carefully curated life. Standing up, Sarah wiped her hands on her robe and grabbed her phone. After a quick Google search, she found a highly rated local plumber and dialed the number. "Hello, this is Liam's Plumbing Services," a deep voice answered. "Hi," Sarah replied, clearing her throat. "I have a bit of a plumbing issue. There's a leak under the bathroom sink." "No problem," Liam said. "I'm actually free this morning. I can be there in about an hour if that works for you." "That would be great," Sarah said, feeling a surprising flutter of relief at the prospect of company, even if it was just a plumber. "Thank you." True to his word, an hour later, a knock sounded at the door. Sarah, who had been folding laundry, glanced at the clock and realized with a start that she was still in her robe. She debated running upstairs to change, but decided against it. "It's just a plumber," she muttered to herself as she hurried to answer the door. When she opened it, Sarah froze. Standing on her porch was not the older, stocky man she had pictured, but a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine for rugged outdoor gear. His hair was tousled in a way that suggested he'd just run his hand through it, and his eyes, blue and piercing, met hers with an ease that made her suddenly conscious of the fact that her robe wasn't tied as tightly as it should. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked, his voice as rich and warm as it had sounded over the phone. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice faltering slightly. She tightened the belt of her robe and stepped aside to let him in. "You must be Liam." "That's me," he said, flashing her a quick, easy smile as he carried his toolbox inside. "Where's the problem?" The guest bathroom," Sarah said, leading him down the hall. She was acutely aware of how close he walked behind her, the faint scent of his cologne, a mix of cedar and something distinctly masculine lingering in the air. "It's just a small leak, I think, but I'm no expert." "Well, let's take a look," Liam said, setting his toolbox down and kneeling by the sink. He rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, revealing strong, tanned forearms. Sarah quickly averted her gaze, feeling ridiculous for noticing. As Liam worked, Sarah hovered nearby, unsure of what to do with herself. "Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Water?" she offered. "Water would be great, thanks," he said, glancing up at her with a grateful smile. For a moment their eyes met, and Sarah felt a strange, almost electric jolt run through her. She quickly turned away, busying herself with finding a glass. When she returned, Liam was tightening a wrench on a pipe, his brow furrowed in concentration. She placed the glass on the counter and lingered, watching as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, confident, assured, that drew her in. It was a stark contrast to James, whose gestures often seemed rushed, distracted, as if he were always thinking 3 steps ahead. "All done," Liam announced, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. "It was just a loose connection. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." "That was fast," Sarah said, surprised by how disappointed she felt that he was finished. "Thank you." "No problem," Liam said, gathering his tools. "If anything else comes up, just give me a call. Here's my card." He handed it to her, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thanks," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. She followed him to the door, watching as he loaded his toolbox into the back of his truck. As Liam drove away, Sarah stood at the window, her thoughts swirling. She told herself it was nothing, just a brief encounter with a stranger. But as she looked down at the card in her hand, she couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest, the small thrill she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt alive, and it scared her. As the day stretched into the afternoon, Sarah found herself unable to focus on anything. She wandered the house aimlessly, her thoughts returning again and again to the man who had fixed her sink. Liam. She told herself it was silly. He was just a plumber, someone who had done his job and left. Yet the memory of his smile, the deep timbre of his voice, and the way his forearms flexed as he tightened the pipe, lingered in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. To distract herself, Sarah decided to clean up the guest bathroom. She grabbed a towel to wipe away the small puddle of water Liam had left behind. As she crouched down, her gaze fell on the spot under the sink where he had worked. She couldn't help but trace her fingers along the cool metal pipe, imagining Liam's hand there instead. The thought sent a shiver through her, and she quickly stood up, chastising herself for the ridiculous fantasy. She walked into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea, her mind still racing. The faint scent of Liam's cologne seemed to linger in the air, though she knew it was impossible. Her fingers brushed against the business card he'd left on the counter. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. His handwriting was neat and precise, the name Liam Reed scrawled under his company's logo. Impulsively, she grabbed her phone and entered the number into her contacts. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button. What would she even say? There was no reason to call him. He had fixed the sink, after all. Still, the thought of hearing his voice again was tempting. With a sigh, she placed the phone back on the counter, shaking her head at herself. Oh, hours later, as Sarah was preparing dinner, the phone rang. She jumped, her heart racing irrationally. When she saw it was her friend Jenna calling, she let out a shaky laugh and answered. "Hey, Sarah," Jenna's cheerful voice filled the line. "How's it going?" "Fine," Sarah said, forcing herself to sound normal. "Just cooking dinner. James is out of town as usual." Oh, surprise, surprise, Jenna said with a knowing laugh. That man works too much. You need some fun, girl. Let's plan a spa day soon, okay? Sarah agreed half-heartedly, her thoughts elsewhere. As they hung up, she found herself staring at her phone again. Before she could overthink it, she scrolled to Liam's number and sent a quick text. Hi, this is Sarah Collins. Just wanted to say thanks again for fixing the sink today. Everything seems perfect. She placed the phone down, her pulse racing. What had possessed her to send that? It was unnecessary and completely out of character for her, yet a part of her craved the connection, however fleeting it might be. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. She snatched it up, her breath catching as she read Liam's reply. Glad to hear it. Let me know if you need help with anything else around the house. Always happy to help. His response was friendly, professional even, but Sarah couldn't ignore the way her heart fluttered. She quickly typed back, I might just take you up on that. The house always seems to have something that needs fixing. She hesitated before hitting send, wondering if she sounded too eager, but she sent it anyway. His reply came almost immediately. Anytime, just give me a call. Sarah set the phone down, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She told herself it was nothing, a polite exchange, nothing more, but deep down, she knew better. She felt a spark that she hadn't felt in years, and it both excited and terrified her. The next morning, Sarah woke early, still thinking about Liam's text. She told herself to let it go, to focus on her day, but as she passed by the guest bathroom, her mind wandered back to his confident movements and warm smile. As if the universe was conspiring against her, the doorbell rang again just after lunchtime. Her heart leapt, and she hurried to the door, smoothing her hair as she went. She opened it to find Liam standing there, toolbox in hand. Good morning, he said, his eyes crinkling with a smile. I was in the area and thought I'd check in, make sure everything was holding up with the sink. Sarah blinked, surprised. Oh, it's fine, but thank you for stopping by. Part of the service, Liam said with a shrug, stepping inside when she moved to let him in. Mind if I take a quick look just to be sure? Of course, go ahead, Sarah said, her voice a little too quick. She followed him down the hall, feeling the same nervous energy she had felt the day before. As Liam knelt to inspect the sink, Sarah found herself watching him again, her eyes tracing the line of his jaw and the way his shirt clung to his broad back. When he glanced up and caught her staring, she quickly looked away, her cheeks burning. Looks good, Liam said after a moment, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. No issues so far. That's a relief, Sarah said, offering him a glass of water. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and for a moment the air between them felt charged. Thanks, Liam said, his voice a little softer. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words, then added, If you ever need anything else, anything at all, just let me know. Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. I will. As Liam left, Sarah watched him from the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't bring herself to extinguish the spark. The next few days passed in a strange haze for Sarah. She tried to focus on her usual routine, running errands, cleaning the house, catching up on a book she'd been meaning to finish. But her mind kept wandering back to Liam. The memory of his smile, the brief touch of his hand as he took the glass of water, the way his eyes seemed to linger on hers longer than necessary. It all played in an endless loop in her head. By the fourth day, Sarah decided enough was enough. She had to put Liam out of her mind. It wasn't healthy, and it certainly wasn't right. She loved James, didn't she? Even if their marriage had grown stale, she had made a commitment, and that had to mean something. She tried to bury herself in chores, scrubbing the kitchen counters with more vigor than necessary, and organizing the pantry until every jar and can was in perfect alignment. But even as she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Liam had said, "If you ever need anything else, anything at all, just let me know." His words felt heavier than they should have, as if they carried a meaning that went beyond a simple offer of help. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, a small part of her wanted to test that offer. Her resolve was put to the test that afternoon when she discovered that the lock on the backyard gate had rusted shut. It wasn't an urgent issue. James could deal with it when he returned. But Sarah found herself reaching for her phone before she could think twice. "Hi, Liam. Sorry to bother you again, but I just noticed the lock on my backyard gate is stuck. Is that something you could help with?" She stared at the message, debating whether to send it. Was she really calling him over for such a minor issue? But before she could talk herself out of it, her thumb hit send. The response came almost instantly. Of course, I can swing by later this afternoon if that works for you." Her heart leapt, and she quickly typed back, "That would be great, thank you so much." When Liam arrived, Sarah felt the same nervous flutter in her chest as she opened the door. He was dressed more casually this time, in a fitted t-shirt and jeans that only seemed to emphasize his athletic build. His toolbox was slung over one shoulder, and he greeted her with that easy, lopsided smile that made her stomach do somersaults. "Show me the problem," he said, his tone light but professional. Sarah led him to the backyard where the gate stood stubbornly shut. As Liam crouched down to examine the lock, Sarah hovered nearby, her arms crossed as if to shield herself from the emotions swirling inside her. "This shouldn't be too hard to fix," Liam said, pulling out a can of lubricant and a set of pliers. "It's just rusted from the weather. Happens all the time." "Thanks for coming on such short notice," Sarah said, her voice a little shaky. "I didn't mean to interrupt your day." "You are not interrupting," Liam said without looking up, his hands deftly working the lock. "I told you. I'm happy to help." There it was again, that hint of something in his voice, something that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She watched as he tugged at the lock, his muscles flexing with the effort. Her gaze lingered on the curve of his jawline, the way a bead of sweat rolled down his temple before he wiped it away with the back of his hand. She felt her face flush and quickly turned away, pretending to adjust the cushions on the patio chairs. "There we go," Liam said after a few minutes, standing up and holding the now functional lock in his hand. "Good as new." "That was fast," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "You're really good at this." "It's what I do," he said with a shrug, setting his tools back in the box. Then he looked at her, his expression softening. "But if I'm being honest, I don't mind going the extra mile for certain clients." Sarah's breath caught. The way he said it, low and deliberate, left no room for misinterpretation. Her heart pounded in her chest as she searched for a response, but none came. "Anyway," Liam said, breaking the tension as he snapped his toolbox shut, "let me know if anything else comes up." "Wait," Sarah blurted out, surprising even herself. "Do you have time for a coffee? It's the least I can do after you've helped me so much." Liam hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, that sounds nice." They sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Sarah poured the coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set the mugs down. Liam leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, and she felt a strange mix of excitement and guilt twisting in her stomach. "So," Liam said, taking a sip of his coffee, "what does Sarah Collins do when she's not calling plumbers for rusted locks?" Sarah laughed, though it sounded a little forced. "Not much, honestly. My life's pretty boring. Cooking, cleaning, the occasional book club meeting. That's about it." "No kids?" Liam asked, his tone casual. Sarah shook her head. "James and I always talked about it, but, well, he's so busy with work. It just never seemed like the right time." Liam nodded, his expression unreadable. "And you? What do you want?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. What did she want? She'd spent so much of her life catering to James's needs and expectations that she'd stopped asking herself that question long ago. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "Maybe it's time you figured it out." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The tension was almost unbearable, and Sarah could feel herself teetering on the edge of something she couldn't name. "I should," she began, but her voice faltered. Liam stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his voice soft. "I'll see you around, Sarah." He walked to the door, leaving Sarah rooted to the spot. As the door closed behind him, she let out a shaky breath, her mind racing. The spark between them had grown into something undeniable, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed them both. Sarah spent the evening in a fog, replaying every moment of Liam's visit in her mind. His parting words echoed in her thoughts. "Maybe it's time you figured it out." There was something both comforting and unsettling about the way he had looked at her, as though he saw through the layers of pretense she wore to hide her dissatisfaction. For the first time in years, Sarah felt truly seen. Yet, with that clarity came an undercurrent of guilt. She sat on the couch with her legs tucked under her, nursing a glass of wine and staring blankly at the television. The flickering images and sound barely registered. Her thoughts were consumed by the growing tension between herself and Liam. She told herself it was harmless, a little flirtation, a moment of excitement in an otherwise dull existence. But deep down, she knew she was playing a dangerous game. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her from her reverie. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from Jenna. "Spa day this weekend. You need it, girl. I'll make the reservation." Sarah hesitated before replying. Jenna would see right through her the moment they were face to face. She always had a knack for sniffing out secrets, and Sarah wasn't ready to share this one, not that there was much to tell. Not yet, anyway. She quickly typed a response. "Sounds perfect. Let me know the time." Placing the phone down, Sarah let her head fall back against the couch. She closed her eyes and tried to banish the image of Liam from her mind, the way his eyes had lingered, the quiet confidence in his voice, the subtle charge in the air when he'd stood so close. She couldn't allow herself to go any further. She wouldn't. But the decision wasn't as final as she wanted it to be. The next morning, Sarah resolved to keep herself busy. Idle hands, she reasoned, were the devil's playground. She spent the day scrubbing the kitchen floors, rearranging her closet, and organizing James's side of the bathroom. But no matter how many tasks she checked off her to-do list, the nagging thoughts persisted. By mid-afternoon, she was exhausted, and no closer to shaking the feeling that had lodged itself in her chest. It wasn't until she stepped outside to water the garden that she saw Liam again. His truck was parked 2 houses down, and he was carrying his toolbox toward a neighbor's front door. He hadn't seen her yet, but the sight of him was enough to send her pulse racing. She debated going back inside, pretending she hadn't noticed him, but something stopped her. Liam. The word was out of her mouth before she could stop herself. He turned, his expression lighting up when he saw her. "Sarah," he called back, lowering his toolbox to the ground. "Fancy seeing you here." She laughed nervously, stepping closer. "I live here, remember?" "Right," he said with a grin, leaning casually against the truck. "How's the lock holding up?" "Good as new," Sarah said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you again for fixing it." "It's no trouble," Liam said, his voice warm. There was a brief pause before he added, "You doing okay?" The question caught Sarah off guard. It was such a simple thing, but the genuine concern in his tone made her chest tighten. She nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just busy, I guess." Liam tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You sure about that?" Sarah hesitated, her resolve crumbling under his steady gaze. She looked down at her feet, searching for the right words. But none came. Instead, she heard herself say, "Do you have time to take a look at the deck? Some of the boards feel loose." Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Sure," he said. "Let me finish up here, and I'll swing by." An hour later, Liam was back at Sarah's house, crouched over the wooden boards of the backyard deck. Sarah hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She told herself she had only asked him to look at the deck because it genuinely needed repairs. But as she watched him work, she knew that wasn't entirely true. "It's not too bad," Liam said, standing and brushing his hands on his jeans. "Just a couple of loose nails and some wear from the weather. I can reinforce it and seal it if you want." "That would be great," Sarah said quickly, then realized how eager she sounded. She cleared her throat. "Whenever you have time, I mean." Liam smiled, and Sarah felt her stomach flip. "I can come back tomorrow," he said. "Shouldn't take more than a couple of hours." "Perfect," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks again, Liam." He nodded, but instead of heading straight to his truck, he lingered. His gaze drifted to hers, and the air between them grew heavy with unspoken words. "You know," he said slowly, "I get the feeling you don't call me just for the repairs." Sarah's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I mean," he hesitated, his hand brushing lightly against hers, sending a shiver up her spine. "It's okay, Sarah. You don't have to say it." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Sarah's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts crashing together in a whirlwind of excitement and fear. She wanted to pull away, to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't. She stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears as Liam's hand lingered against hers. Finally, she found her voice. "I think you should go," she said, though the words lacked conviction. Liam searched her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice soft. "But if you change your mind, you know where to find me." He turned and walked to his truck, leaving Sarah standing on the deck, her heart racing and her thoughts in turmoil. As she watched him drive away, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. She had crossed a line, not physically, but emotionally, and deep down she knew there was no turning back. The next morning dawned gray and quiet, with the heavy scent of rain hanging in the air. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring out at the backyard deck. It looked the same as it always had, weathered but sturdy, a place where she and James had shared countless dinners on summer evenings. Yet now it felt different, as if the air itself carried the weight of something unresolved. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of Liam, his words, his touch, the way his gaze seemed to pierce through her. Everything about him lingered, an unshakable presence in her thoughts. She had tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was just a harmless infatuation brought on by her loneliness. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the truth. Liam had awakened something in her, something she hadn't felt in years. At precisely 11 a.m., the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway snapped Sarah out of her thoughts. Her heart leapt into her throat as she peeked through the curtains. Liam stepped out, toolbox in hand, his easy confidence as striking as ever. For a moment she considered sending him away. She could make up an excuse, say James would handle the deck repairs himself. But before she could act on the thought, Liam was already at the door, knocking lightly. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door. "Morning," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Morning," Liam replied, flashing her a warm smile. "Ready for me to get started?" She nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. "The deck's all yours." Liam chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll have it looking good as new in no time." As Liam headed outside, Sarah lingered by the window, watching him work. He moved with purpose, his strong hands deftly removing the loose boards and hammering in new nails. The rhythmic sound of the hammer filled the air, but Sarah barely noticed. Her eyes were drawn to the way his shirt clung to his back, the muscles in his arms flexing with each movement. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks and quickly turned away, trying to busy herself with cleaning the kitchen. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the tension building inside her. It was as if the very air in the house had shifted, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Every sound, every movement seemed to amplify her awareness of Liam's presence just a few feet away. By the time Liam finished the repairs, the sky had darkened and a light drizzle had begun to fall. He stepped into the kitchen, his hair slightly damp and his shirt clinging to his chest. Sarah handed him a towel, avoiding his gaze as he dried off. "Thanks," he said, his voice low. "The deck's all set, should hold up for a good while now." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. "That's great. I really appreciate it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Liam glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Everything feels complicated." Liam stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "Sometimes it's okay to let yourself feel something, to want something." His words sent a shiver through her, and Sarah felt her resolve begin to crumble. She knew she should stop this, that she should send him away before things went too far. But she couldn't. She didn't want to. For the first time in years, she felt alive, and the thought of letting that slip away was unbearable. Liam reached out, his hand brushing lightly against hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me to stop, and I will." Sarah looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the hesitation that mirrored her own. but beneath it all there was a longing, a hunger that matched the one she felt deep inside. "I can't," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. That was all the invitation Liam needed. He closed the distance between them, his hand cupping her face as he leaned in. Their lips met, tentative at first, as though testing the waters. But the hesitation quickly gave way to something deeper, more urgent. Sarah's hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the world around them seemed to fade away. For a brief, stolen moment, nothing else mattered. Not the guilt, not the consequences, only the overwhelming rush of desire that had been building between them for days. Sarah felt as though she were drowning, swept away by a tide she couldn't resist. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. Liam's hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. "I should go," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah nodded, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. "Maybe you should." But neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Liam's gaze searched hers, as though looking for permission to stay, to take things further. And, for a fleeting moment, Sarah considered letting him. Finally, Liam stepped back, his hand falling away. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said quietly. "You too," she replied, her voice trembling. She watched as he left, the sound of the door closing behind him, echoing through the house. Sarah sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, her mind reeling. She had crossed a line, there was no denying that now. And though she knew she should feel ashamed, all she could think about was how alive she had felt in Liam's arms. It wasn't over, not yet. The days after Liam's departure felt like a fever dream to Sarah. She moved through her routines mechanically, making the bed, preparing meals, answering calls from James with her usual bright tone. But beneath the surface, her thoughts were consumed by what had happened. Every quiet moment was filled with the memory of Liam's touch, the way his lips had felt against hers, and the quiet intensity in his eyes as he had walked out the door. She told herself it was a one-time lapse, a moment of weakness born out of her loneliness and frustration. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The line they had crossed wasn't a boundary she could simply redraw. It lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, pulling her toward him like a magnet. By the third day, Sarah found herself scrolling through her contacts and stopping at Liam's name. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button, her heart racing. Before she could second-guess herself, she pressed it. The phone rang twice before Liam answered, his voice warm but cautious. "Sarah." "Hi," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I just wanted to thank you again for fixing the deck. It looks great." Liam chuckled softly. "You already thanked me, remember?" "I know," Sarah said quickly, feeling foolish. "I guess I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a pause on the other end, and when Liam spoke again, his voice was softer. "I've been thinking about you." The words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, and she felt her grip tighten on the phone. "I can't stop thinking about you either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam sighed, the sound heavy with emotion. "This isn't easy for me, Sarah. I don't want to complicate your life any more than it already is." "I know," Sarah said, "but I don't think I can stay away." Neither of them spoke for a moment, the silence between them thick with longing and uncertainty. Finally, Liam broke it. I'm working on a job near your place tomorrow. If you want to talk, really talk, I can stop by." Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what she was agreeing to, what it could mean, but the thought of seeing him again was too tempting to resist. "Okay," she said softly. "Tomorrow." The following day, Sarah could barely focus. She spent the morning pacing the house, straightening cushions that didn't need fixing, and wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. By the time Liam's truck pulled into the driveway, she felt like her heart was about to burst out of her chest. She opened the door before he could knock, her breath catching at the sight of him. He was dressed casually, his tool belt slung low on his hips, and his expression was a mix of apprehension and something deeper, something that mirrored the emotion swirling inside her. "Hi," he said, his voice soft. "Hi," Sarah replied, stepping aside to let him in. They stood in the entryway for a moment, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. Finally, Liam reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She reached up, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. Liam cupped her face with his hand, his touch gentle but firm, and before she could think twice, his lips were on hers. The kiss was different this time. Not tentative or hesitant, but urgent and hungry. Sarah felt herself melt into him, her hands sliding up to wrap around his neck as he pulled her closer. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in their own private universe. Liam guided her to the living room, his hands never leaving her, and they sank onto the couch together. Sarah's mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of emotions, guilt, desire, fear, and something she couldn't quite name, but for the first time in years, she felt alive, and she couldn't bring herself to let go of that feeling. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the couch, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the curtains. Sarah rested her head on Liam's chest, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread, the weight of what they had done settling over her like a blanket. "We shouldn't have done this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam stroked her hair, his touch soothing. "I know," he said, "but I don't regret it." Sarah looked up at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. "Neither do I," she admitted, "but what happens now?" Liam sighed, his hand falling to rest on her shoulder. "That's up to you, Sarah. I don't want to make things harder for you, but if you want this, if you want us, I'm here." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She didn't know what she wanted. Her life with James felt like a distant memory, a hollow shell of what it had once been. But the idea of tearing everything apart, of hurting him, was unbearable. And yet, the thought of letting Liam go was equally painful. "I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling. Liam nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." They lay there for a while longer, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises and lingering doubts. When Liam finally left, Sarah stood at the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the street. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. For better or worse, there was no turning back now. The days following Liam's visit were a storm of conflicting emotions for Sarah. She threw herself into her daily routine, hoping that staying busy would keep the memories at bay, but it was futile. The house, so quiet and familiar, now felt like a stranger, its walls bearing silent witness to the choices she'd made. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of sunlight through the windows seemed to echo Liam's name. James's nightly calls became an exercise in guilt. She tried to sound cheerful, listening to him drone on about business meetings and long flights, but her responses felt hollow. The man on the other end of the line felt like a stranger, a distant figure who had somehow drifted away without either of them noticing. One evening, as Sarah sat in the living room scrolling aimlessly through her phone, she received a text from Jenna. "Coffee tomorrow? Need girl time." Sarah stared at the screen, debating whether to reply. Jenna would see through her in an instant. She always did. But the thought of spending another day alone with her thoughts was unbearable. "Sure, usual spot?" she typed back. "You bet. 10 a.m., Jenna replied, punctuating the message with the heart emoji. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the cafe early, hoping to steel herself for Jenna's inevitable questions. She ordered a latte and sat by the window, watching the world outside go about its business. Couples strolled by, holding hands and laughing, and Sarah felt a pang of envy. She wondered if they knew how lucky they were, or if they too carried secrets behind their smiles. "Hey, stranger," Jenna's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. She turned to see her friend sliding into the seat across from her, a bright smile on her face. "You look distracted." "Do I?" Sarah said, forcing a laugh. "Just tired, I guess." "Uh-huh," Jenna said, raising an eyebrow. "You've been tired a lot lately. Something you want to tell me?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Nothing's wrong," she said quickly. "Just the usual. James is away again, and the house feels so quiet." Jenna leaned back, studying her. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." "I know," Sarah said, her voice soft. She hesitated, feeling the words bubble up inside her, but before she could say anything more, Jenna's phone buzzed, drawing her attention away. Sarah let out a silent sigh of relief. As much as she wanted to confide in someone, the thought of saying it out loud, admitting to what she'd done, felt impossible. That afternoon, as Sarah returned home, she noticed a package on the doorstep. She picked it up, glancing at the label. It was addressed to James. Inside the house, she placed it on the kitchen counter, her mind swirling with the realization that he would be back soon. The thought filled her with a mixture of relief and dread. Part of her longed for his presence, for the familiar comfort of their life together. But another part, the part that had come alive with Liam, felt like a caged animal, desperate for freedom. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Liam. "Thinking about you." Sarah's breath caught. Her fingers hovered over the screen, torn between replying and ignoring him. Finally, she typed, "I can't stop thinking about you either." The message was barely sent when the sound of the front door opening startled her. She spun around to see James standing there, his suitcase in hand. "Hey," he said, smiling. "Surprise, I got an earlier flight." Sarah's heart raced as she forced a smile. "James, I didn't expect you back so soon." He stepped forward, wrapping her in a hug. "I missed you," he said, his voice warm. "I missed you too," Sarah replied, her words thick with guilt. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, James seemed more attentive than usual. He asked about her week, about the house, about the neighbors. Sarah answered as best she could, her stomach nodding with every question. At one point, James paused, his fork hovering in midair. By the way, Mrs. Jenkins mentioned something interesting. She said there was a plumber's truck parked here for a long time the other day. Sarah's heart stopped. She felt the blood drain from her face as she struggled to keep her expression neutral. "Oh," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Yeah, we had a problem with the deck. He's just fixing it." James studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You didn't mention it when we talked." "It slipped my mind," Sarah said quickly, taking a sip of water to hide her trembling hands. "It wasn't a big deal." James nodded slowly, though the suspicion in his eyes lingered. "Oh, if you say so." The tension between them was palpable over the next few days. James didn't bring up the plumber again, but Sarah could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. The weight of her guilt grew heavier with each passing moment, and she found herself avoiding his gaze, making excuses to leave the room whenever the silence became too much. One evening, as Sarah folded laundry in the bedroom, James walked in, his expression serious. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked. Sarah's hands stilled, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange," James said, crossing his arms. "Distracted, nervous. And then there's the plumber." "There's nothing going on," Sarah said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" James said, his tone laced with doubt. Sarah turned away, focusing on the pile of clothes in front of her. "I don't know what you want me to say, James. I've been lonely, okay? You're always gone, and I'm here by myself, trying to keep everything together." James's expression softened, and he stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I didn't realize," he began, his voice quiet. "I didn't know you felt that way." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay her guilt bare and beg for forgiveness. But she couldn't. The truth would destroy him, destroy them. "I just need us to feel like a team again," she said instead, her voice trembling. "I need to feel like we're in this together." James nodded, his grip on her shoulder tightening. "Ah, we are," he said. "I'll do better, Sarah. I promise." As he pulled her into an embrace, Sarah felt a wave of relief and regret wash over her. She knew his promise was sincere, but she also knew it might be too late. Sarah sat in the dim light of the living room, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass as James's words echoed in her mind. "I'll do better. I promise." The sincerity in his voice had been unmistakable, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah had felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she could leave Liam behind and salvage the life she had built with James. But as the evening stretched on, the weight of her actions pressed down on her like a stone. Her phone sat on the coffee table, a silent reminder of the connection she couldn't seem to sever. She stared at it, willing herself not to pick it up, not to text Liam. But the longer she sat there, the harder it became to resist. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she grabbed the phone and scrolled to Liam's name. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the words she wanted to say trapped in her throat. Before she could type anything, the phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. It was a message from Liam. "Oh, are you okay?" Sarah's heart raced. She hesitated for only a moment before replying. "I don't know. I think James is starting to suspect something." The response came almost immediately. "Do you want me to come over?" Her breath caught. The thought of seeing Liam again, of feeling the comfort of his presence, was both thrilling and terrifying. She typed back, "No, not tonight." "Okay," Liam replied, "but I'm here if you need me." Sarah set the phone down, her hands trembling. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the couch, trying to steady her breathing. She knew she couldn't keep doing this, living in two worlds, torn between the safety of her marriage and the forbidden allure of Liam. She had to make a choice. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of James moving around in the kitchen. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, before forcing herself to get up. When she entered the kitchen, James was pouring himself a cup of coffee, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, glancing at her. "Morning," Sarah replied, her voice tentative. She busied herself with making toast, the silence between them thick with tension. James set his cup down and turned to face her. "I was thinking," he said slowly. Maybe we should take a trip. Just the two of us. Get away for a while and reconnect." Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the toaster. A trip with James sounded like the perfect opportunity to repair their relationship, to leave behind the complications and temptations of their everyday life. But the thought of leaving Liam, even for a short time, filled her with an ache she couldn't ignore. "That sounds nice," she said finally, forcing a smile. "Where were you thinking?" "Maybe the coast," James said, his tone softening. "You always loved the beach." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. "Let's talk about it tonight," she said. "I need to run some errands." James studied her for a moment before nodding. "Okay, let me know what you decide." As soon as Sarah was out of the house, she found herself driving aimlessly, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. She needed clarity, a moment of stillness to figure out what she truly wanted. Without realizing it, she found herself pulling into a quiet park on the edge of town. She parked the car and sat there, staring out at the trees, the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, the only thing breaking the silence. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. It was Liam. "I can't stop thinking about you. Can we talk?" Sarah closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the phone. She knew she shouldn't reply, that every message, every meeting with Liam only complicated things further. But the pull she felt toward him was impossible to ignore. "Meet me at the park," she typed back before she could change her mind. Liam arrived 20 minutes later, his expression a mix of concern and longing as he approached her. They sat together on a bench, the distance between them a stark contrast to the intimacy they had shared just days ago. "What's going on?" Liam asked, his voice gentle. Sarah stared down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "James wants to take a trip. He thinks it'll help us reconnect." Liam was silent for a moment. "And what do you think?" "I think," Sarah began, her voice breaking, "I think I don't know what I want anymore." Liam reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "You don't have to figure it out all at once, Sarah, but you do have to be honest. With yourself, with James, with me." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, and she looked up at him, her heart aching. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "You won't," Liam said firmly, "but this, whatever this is between us, it can't go on like this. You have to decide, Sarah, and whatever you choose, I'll respect it." Sarah nodded, her chest tightening. She knew he was right. The path she was on was unsustainable, a fragile balancing act that would inevitably come crashing down. but the thought of letting go, of either Liam or James, felt unbearable. "I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling. Liam's gaze softened, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here." As he stood to leave, Sarah watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. She had reached a crossroads, and the path she chose would define the rest of her life. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze. After leaving the park, she drove aimlessly around town, her mind circling the same questions. What do I want? What am I willing to lose? She thought about James, his promise to do better, the way he had held her close the night before as if he could sense her slipping away. She thought about Liam, his intensity, his honesty, and the way he made her feel alive for the first time in years. When she finally pulled into the driveway, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. Sarah sat in the car for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She had to make a decision, but no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't see a way to move forward without breaking someone's heart, including her own. Inside, the house was quiet. James had left a note on the counter, "Went for a run, be back soon." She stared at the words, her stomach churning with guilt. He was trying, she knew that, but was it enough? Could their marriage survive the weight of her betrayal? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Liam. "I hope you're okay. Just remember, you're not alone in this." Sarah's chest tightened as she read the words. Liam had been nothing but patient and understanding, even as she dragged him into the mess of her indecision. She didn't deserve him, or James for that matter, but she couldn't deny the truth. She was at the center of it all, the one who had set this chain of events in motion, and now it was up to her to put an end to it. That evening, James returned home with an energy she hadn't seen in him in months. He kissed her on the cheek and asked about her day, his tone light and hopeful. Sarah tried to match his enthusiasm, but her smile felt brittle, her answers clipped. She could feel his gaze lingering on her, as if he were searching for a crack in her facade. After dinner, James poured them each a glass of wine and sat across from her at the kitchen table. "So," he began, his voice casual but tinged with an edge of curiosity. "Have you thought about the trip?" Sarah nodded, her hands tightening around the stem of her glass. "I think it's a good idea. It might be exactly what we need." James smiled, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I'm glad to hear that. I'll start looking at dates and booking something." As he spoke, Sarah felt a pang of guilt twist in her chest. She wanted to believe they could fix what was broken, that a few days away could erase the distance between them, but she knew it wasn't that simple. A trip wouldn't undo what she had done. It wouldn't erase Liam from her mind or her heart. She set her glass down, her hands trembling. "James," she said, her voice shaky, "there's something I need to tell you." James's smile faded, his brows knitting together in concern. "What is it?" Sarah took a deep breath, her stomach churning. She couldn't bring herself to say the words, to confess everything. Instead, she settled on a half-truth. "I've been feeling lost, lonely, and I think I've been keeping things from you about how I feel, about us." James leaned forward, his expression softening. "Sarah, I know I've been distant. I know I've put work ahead of us more times than I should have. But I'm here now. I'm listening." "I know," Sarah said, her voice cracking, "but I'm scared it might not be enough." James reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "It is," he said firmly. It has to be. We'll figure it out, Sarah. Together. His words were earnest, filled with a sincerity that made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. She wanted to believe him, to believe that they could find their way back to each other. But the shadow of Liam loomed large in her mind, a reminder of the parts of herself she couldn't ignore. The next morning, Sarah woke early, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She spent the day in a flurry of activity, cleaning the house and organizing closets in a desperate attempt to distract herself. By mid-afternoon, she had exhausted every chore she could think of, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. Liam's number was at the top of her call log, a silent temptation she couldn't seem to ignore. She knew she needed to talk to him, to give him the closure he deserved. But every time she tried to dial his number, her fingers froze. Finally, the doorbell rang, startling her. She opened the door to find Liam standing there, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Hi," he said, his voice soft. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stop thinking about you." Sarah stepped aside to let him in, her heart racing. "I've been thinking about you too," she admitted. They stood in the entryway, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Liam reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "What's going on, Sarah? Talk to me." "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "James is trying, he wants to fix things, and I want to believe we can, but but you don't know if you can let go of this," Liam finished, his tone gentle. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want to hurt him, but I don't want to lose you either." Liam's gaze softened and he stepped closer, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You have to choose, Sarah. I don't want to pressure you, but you can't keep living like this. It's not fair to any of us, including you." Sarah closed her eyes, her chest tightening. She knew he was right. The life she had been clinging to was unraveling, and the only way to move forward was to face the truth. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But just know, I'm here if you want me." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, the gesture tender and bittersweet. Then he turned and walked out the door, leaving Sarah standing in the entryway, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. That evening, Sarah and James sat together on the couch, the silence between them comfortable but fragile. James reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I know it's not perfect, but we'll get there." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. "I hope so." As the night wore on, Sarah's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Liam. "I'm thinking of you." Ah. Her heart ached as she stared at the words. She set the phone face down, her decision still out of reach. For now, she could only sit with the uncertainty, knowing that whatever path she chose would change her life forever. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring out the window as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the backyard. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. James had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of work, and the silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Her thoughts, as always, drifted to Liam, his touch, his voice, the way he had looked at her as though she were the only thing that mattered. But tonight those memories felt different. The thrill she had once felt when thinking of Liam was muted, replaced by a dull ache. She couldn't deny the connection they shared, the way he had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But as she stood there, alone in the dim light, another truth began to take shape. Liam wasn't the answer to her unhappiness. He was a symptom of it. For years, Sarah had poured herself into her marriage, into being the perfect wife, the perfect homemaker. When James became distant, she filled the void with routines and distractions, convincing herself that the cracks in their relationship were normal, inevitable. But when Liam came into her life, he exposed something she had been too afraid to confront. The emptiness she felt wasn't about James. It wouldn't be all that. She thought about the choices she had made, the lines she had crossed. She had told herself it was about finding something James couldn't give her: passion, excitement, validation. But now she realized those things couldn't come from someone else. They had to come from within. Liam hadn't awakened something new in her. He had simply shone a light on what was already there. A woman who had lost herself in the pursuit of being everything to everyone else. Tears filled her eyes as she gripped the edge of the counter. She had been looking for an escape, a way to fill the void, but in doing so she had only created more pain, for James, for Liam, and for herself. She couldn't keep running from the truth. If she wanted to find happiness, she needed to confront her own fears and insecurities. She needed to rediscover who she was, not as James's wife or Liam's lover, but as Sarah. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew one thing: she couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between two lives. She needed to take responsibility for her choices, to face the consequences of her actions, and to start rebuilding, not just her marriage, but herself. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Sarah wiped her tears and took a deep breath. It was time to stop running. It was time to find her way back to herself.